While the panel is taking its seats, I think I want to give a special shout out to Rob Freudenberg and his team, the folks who look like they're sleep deprived in the back of the room. Lucretia Montemayor, Sarah Brent McCoy, Emily Corman, Ellis, the whole team there. I think they've done an incredible job putting this research together. And what you all don't know is that 3 weeks ago, most of them were in Hyde Park, New York, organizing a conference on the economic benefits of open space preservation. So somehow they kind of turn on a dime, and I'm not sure what we'll be doing in early January, but bad joke. Sorry, Rob. But it's really an incredible team, and I think that the research that they've done sets up this conversation and issue. So please join me in kind of congratulating them. Thanks also to Anna and the New School for hosting us here and everybody joining us. I see among the audience some of our board members, members of RPA's committees, and others who have really been dedicated to this work and helping collaborate on this. We're aware at RPA that the work we do, it really depends on the partners and the folks in academia, in the public sector, in the business community, and others who kind of take our ideas and work them out. One special category, I won't call them all out, but there are many former RPA employees and staff here in the room. We lovingly refer to them as our sleeper cells. Those are the people who kind of take the RPA ideas and go out into the world to implement them, and it's a pleasure to see many of you. As Rob said, we have a fantastic panel here that covers a wide range of issues, from design to public policy, philanthropy and ecology and science to economic development and implementation. So I'm thrilled to and what I'll do is I'll key up a couple questions for them. We didn't rehearse this at all, so we'll see how it comes out. They don't have any idea what I'm going to say. And then I'll open it up to the audience in a few minutes for questions from you to kind of talk about this. But maybe Dan, as the public official at the table, if I can kind of put you on the spot. I mean, when Rob put up his slide about the taking action and what needs to happen, I could even like rewind it for you. Let me see if I can do this. Yeah, I feel like that's your job description, right? So
it's good to write it down finally.
There you go. But so how would you kind of, from the city's perspective and what you're doing, what do you think about this list? How are you approaching the issues? How do you see the city trying to address this?
Sure, thanks, Tom. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks to the fellow panelists as well. You know, I think this report is really helpful and points in the right direction of the kind of things we're thinking about. The city has been implementing its program. Certainly, Hurricane Sandy was very much highlighted our vulnerabilities to the risks of coastal storms, but it also widened our understanding of the fuller risks of climate change. And so we've been really approaching it from a multi-hazard point of view. We understand the New York City Panel on Climate Change projections are highlighting we're going to have more rain, we're going to have more heat, there's more, certainly more higher likelihood and intensity of storm events, and of course sea level rise. And all of that has been playing into the way we've been doing our vulnerability assessments across the city, and not just on the coastline either. I think it's important to recognize that we've really taken a multi-layered approach to thinking about our neighborhoods, and there's different risks in different neighborhoods, but also looking at our building codes, our zoning codes, and adapting a million buildings across the city is high on our priority list. Our infrastructure, and we've received nearly $10 billion from FEMA. All of those dollars are subject to the federal flood risk management standard that's coming into effect, that we are incorporating sea level rise into our projections and how we're actually building those projects. And of course the work we're doing on our coastlines and some of the most vulnerable neighborhoods that you highlighted here along the Rockaway Peninsula, particularly on the Bay side, and the neighborhoods of Edgemere and Somerville and Arverne, but also Broad Channel, looking on the South Shore of Staten Island. There's flood risk all over the city, and when we did this analysis a couple years ago, and under Seth's leadership with the SIR process, we highlighted that there's about 8% of the city's shoreline is subject to inundation on that tidal basis in the 2050s with about 2.5 feet of sea level rise. And that, that's, on the one hand, it's not catastrophic, but it certainly points out that there's some serious vulnerability. And one of the projects that we've been implementing through our program is with federal funds, we pulled together something called our Raised Shorelines program and put $100 million and a little bit more actually on the table to begin, and we did a full citywide assessment, 520 miles of coastline, looking at a full range of factors, the vulnerability, the local infrastructure, certainly the social vulnerability indices, did a really, I think, in-depth analysis of all the places where we're at risk of sea level rise, and we're already putting into design projects to begin mitigating those in very discrete and locally tailored ways. And we're looking at, again, some of the same neighborhoods, the back end of the Rockaways and others. So it's, there are both, we highlight what's happening through the rebuild by design process as big projects, and those are important. That's by no means the only things we're doing, and the race shorelines is one example of that. The ways that we are reforming our waterfront management program and upgrading our bulkheads and beginning to incorporate sea level rise into that as a more normal course of business is important to us. So I think there's a lot of things happening across the agencies, and I see a lot of city folks here, and I want to thank them for all their work, because they've been able to really institutionalize this thinking and begin to take the steps to incorporate sea level rise. That being said, there's a whole lot more to do, right? Yeah. It's by no means we're done, and this is the beginning of a long-term adaptation. It is a process, what we think of as flexible adaptation pathways, where it's not one investment and we're done. It's the first investments, and we're really getting off the ground after having 0 coastal protections in this city before Hurricane Sandy hit, and beginning that process and adapting over time. And I think we're going to continue to build on that work as we go. It's not just going to be the one investment.
Great. Well, we have a guest here on the panel from outside the region, David Waggonner, to kind of. And whenever we talk about these issues, of course, we look to New Orleans, which has probably been more heavily impacted and affected by these issues than any other city in the United States to date. But David, kind of from your perspective coming in, and he's been enormously influential to us in our thinking about this, how do you kind of assess this approach, and what would you say are some of the lessons you'd want to share from your own experience? Let's pass the...
You have to work where you are, so the lessons aren't so transferable from the Netherlands to New Orleans, except for contrast and compare reasons. You have to, people care about what's theirs. They care about the local condition. New York famously cares about New York. And New Orleans, in another way, cares about itself. There are things to learn. When I see the amount of inundated land, one thing that occurs is New Orleans is about 160 square miles within levees. So, you start talking about you don't lose that until 6 feet of sea level rise, or 4. And so, the scale of loss in coastal Louisiana beyond New Orleans, because New Orleans is now leveed, protected, as long as you can support it and you don't get into such an absurd condition, survives. But there's a scalar condition here. There's also an economic scale, which is why this is so valuable, because this is the economic center of the country, whereas New Orleans is a vital port. Right. So you have to understand the critical asset. If you read the Bloomberg News thing last week, when they started to show the repetitive loss around the country, you can still make a case that you need to support New Orleans as a country because of its port activity. As long as the Mississippi's there, you need a place to trade. So I think that it's not all one. It's not all the same. The Netherlands can afford that flood defense system because it has all its critical assets, all its wealth, all its GDP being produced in that condition. That can be a really hard-hearted approach. And so you have to start to balance and say, well, what can secure more? How do you secure the cultural heritage? How do you secure the historic? But the part that I think we lose very quickly, and the piece missing there is always missing, is the natural system. Maybe Sacha speaks about that, but if you don't secure the natural system, you lose everything. The reason we're in this trouble is because we lost the natural system. New Orleans became a engineered delta city with no water. So, you have to prioritize this natural system. In some terms, you almost have to go negative first and say what happens without the people, because the moves you make to secure it for people may cut yourself off from being able to survive on the planet.
That's a provocative statement, Sacha. Maybe I'll turn that to you to follow up on it. How would you say about that? One of the things that we've been thinking about, and I hope this is reflected in the report, is to kind of think about the future waterfront. One of the great legacies of RPA was actually the proposal to create the Gateway National Recreation Area and the kind of first urban federal park. And when we think towards the next generation of parks, we've been thinking maybe it is going to be it's going to be a changed landscape, dramatically changed. So we've been thinking about that, but I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
So
Is that on?
I'm not sure it's on. We tend to think of a lot in this kind of space of using nature as our protector, and I think that's a crucial part, and I'll come back to that. But from the outset, I want to also posit that that the coastal environment, the nature in this equation, is really crucial for its own in its own ways, both as the most productive component of our entire ecosystem on the coast. It's where our fisheries come from. It's where our carbon is stored. It's an enormously important component of the coastal system, period. And we need to be thinking about adapting the nature, irrespective of its protective capacities. But there are enormous protective capacities represented by nature for a variety of reasons. For one, it breaks down energy, right? So these habitats resist energy, and they therefore reduce wave damages and that sort of thing. There's a really interesting study by Nature Conservancy and Wildlife Conservation Society suggesting that nature saved the eastern U.S. more than $500 million, $650 million during Sandy by reduced energy primarily. Another way, and this works in places like New Orleans, it absorbs storm surges. You need miles and miles of wetland to absorb storm surges. We don't have that for the most part here in New York, although the Meadowlands is a different case to some extent. So I think that we are increasingly seeing innovative design that incorporates both natural and built elements. What is interesting, though, is as you think about it that as a long-term process, natural systems tend to build themselves in response to sea level rise. Actual human-built systems don't build themselves as sea level rises. So if we can combine that kind of self-generative capacity of nature to respond to this, we have some interesting opportunities as we integrate nature into our coasts.
Well, that's a wonderful segue maybe to turn to the developer on the panel to say, what do you see happening in your world, and is it learning, and is the development community doing a better job, or are we setting ourselves up for more problems?
Look, I think that especially Sandy, but all of the effects of climate change that we've increasingly seen have impacted people and changed to a certain degree the way that they think. But I also think that there's a challenge in that we have a very long-term problem, albeit a problem that incrementally all along the way is going to be increasingly more dire. But the way people tend to think, both because we all have limited lifetimes and also because within our lifetimes, things that we work on have even more limited lifetimes. I think in many ways either forces or causes us to think in more short-term increments. And so, for example, when it comes to real estate development, it's very rare that a real estate developer is going to ask, what is this place going to look like 100 years from now? It's pretty rare for people to ask, what is this going to look like 20 years from now? That's because many developers plan to build and sell, and so they're not planning on sticking around, so it's going to be someone else's problems. Banks, when you finance for a limited period of time. It's often not 20 years either. And so the banks don't look that far out in the future. And the insurance companies don't look that far out in the future. So how do you change people's thinking? I think the only way to do that is through a combination of three things. One is wake-up calls. Hurricane Sandy, as I mentioned, did force people to realize that these things that seemed like they were happening in the out years may actually already be happening. And certainly on projects that we're working on where we're on or near the water, we're thinking about things like sea level rise to a certain extent, but storm surge even more, much more actively than I would imagine we would have thought of them 4 or 5 years ago. And so, for example, we're developing a project, Pier 57 on the west side of Manhattan, a very important part of our planning, something that our banks insisted on, something that our insurance companies insisted on, is a bladder that we're going to build, an inflatable bladder that can be built around it to protect the pier from storm surge. Again, I don't think we would have been talking about something like that before Sandy. So that's one important piece of the puzzle. I think a second important piece of the puzzle is for us to break the problem down into incremental parts. And I think Dan and the work that he's doing is a great example of working in this way. You know, if you look out at these maps and you look at where we're going to be in 2100, the problem almost becomes overwhelming. And the sea level rise maps don't even begin to account for what the 100-year floodplain is going to look like. They don't account for where heat is going to affect us. I mean, it's everywhere that's going to be extremely heavily burdened by the impacts of climate change. And when you talk to the public, when you talk to the business community and you say, okay, we have to plan for that, I think people just freeze up. And I think a lot of the reason why we haven't made more progress, I mean, everyone in this room is a true believer, I would assume, but the reason why we haven't made more progress in preparing our country and the world for these problems is just the problems are too big. And I think when you break them down into their component parts and you say, okay, we're not going to solve the 100-year problem today, but let's solve the next 10 years, let's solve the next 20 years, buy ourselves some time to develop the solutions for the 20 years after that and the 20 years after that. I think that's the second piece of the solution. And I think that's something that business can much more easily react to than the 100-year problem. And then the last thing that I would say is I think government is the critical piece here. And it's a little bit worrying the direction our government is going in, but government needs to impose the discipline on the development community, on the business community, that the development community and business community themselves are either unwilling or unable to impose on their own projects. And I think that New York City deserves a lot of credit for the work that they've done. There are certainly other cities and states across the country that are doing that. But we need to really do that on a national and international scale. You know, I guess the next 4+ years will tell us whether, in fact, we're in a position to do that.
You had to go there. Yeah. Well, let me come back to New York City, Dan. I mean, in your kind of negotiations with the private sector and the development community and things, is it does the city need to have you know, if it's a carrot and stick approach, are there sufficient carrots for you right now? Do you need bigger sticks? What's it going to take?
Well,
there we go. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a couple things I guess to respond to on this. One is that the things we've been doing to bake in through the zoning code, through the building code, to make sure that we're adapting and, you know, adding freeboard to the building code, making sure we're regulating a more expansive floodplain. You know, it doesn't need to be a one-off conversation. I guess is the point, is that if we build it into, you know, and we institutionalize it, then we're going to be more successful, and it doesn't have to be the one-off. And so by updating the code and by taking a hard look at our zoning codes, and the Department of City Planning has been doing great work across the city on its resilient neighborhood studies, looking at the ways in which we can use the zoning code to achieve greater resiliency and get greater flood protection across the city. And that is definitely accounting for sea level rise in all of its planning. Really looking at how we can limit vulnerability and how we can design neighborhoods and ultimately you know, think about how we're using land and land use particularly as a tool for resiliency. And so the other, I guess another point I wanted to make is that it's so important, we continue to, I wanted to just give credit to this report for two major things. One, using the science to make sure that we're continuing to drive this conversation, because there's a lot of talk around, you know, the numbers and what the projections are going to be. Sometimes it can be apocalyptic, sometimes it can be, you know, understated, but, you know, using the MPCC, our friends at places like the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay, really making sure that we are driving the science behind what we're doing. And the second piece I think on this is that really happy to see that the point around carbon emissions. And the city's work and its commitment on 80 by 50, 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050 really is probably the floor of what we need to achieve in many ways to be compliant with the Paris Agreement. The nations of the world have come together. Now we're in a really, and to maybe follow up Seth's point, we are in an uncertain time on what that's actually going to do, but it really highlights the value of local and cities to be able to drive forward this message and not necessarily relying on higher levels of government. We have the tools here. We're able to take action. I think it's important that we do that on both the mitigation of our greenhouse gases as well as our adaptation to the risks that are coming.
Yeah. Well, but I'm going to challenge something, and maybe any of you want to respond to this. But to some degree, I think we recognize, and we say in the report, we're kind of blessed to the degree that New York City has got its act together. After Sandy, and Seth was one of the lead authors of the SIR report. New York State has been ahead of much of the rest of the country on these issues. We had initiatives like Rebuild by Design. So things have gone, we're certainly, we can pat ourselves on the back, or we'd want to. And then at the same time, from our perspective, way too often, proposals come forward, projects come forward, people are talking about the future from RPA's perspective. We're kind of talking about southeastern Queens and vulnerable communities, lots of public housing, and maybe even the city talking about putting more there. And you see a disconnect still in the conversation, that we aren't yet there. It would be wrong to think that folks, at the agencies thinking about our large-scale infrastructure are, I think, fully aware of this or kind of incorporating these plans into it. So I still feel like there's a disconnect that we ought to kind of confront here and maybe try to think about what is it going to take to kind of get this further embedded in the conversation and make these decisions. I actually will look to kind of either Sacha or David as people who are working in other parts of the country. Are there still things that we haven't been doing here that we ought to be doing, or are we being alarmist on this? It's a tough question, but
Well, one of the things that I think you notice quickly when you leave the friendly confines of the 5 boroughs is that this kind of attention and the resources that are directed to the issue here are, astronomical compared to small communities along the coast, around the entire nation. I mean, this is, if you think about just sea level rise as a community process challenge, not the money, not the infrastructure, but the community process that's necessary to come to these decisions, it's daunting. I mean, we've been lucky enough, my former position at Scenic Hudson with Consensus Building Institute and DEC here, we worked with a number of communities along the Hudson to begin this conversation. And after every meeting, I went home thinking, I'm wiped. I can't believe that thousands of communities are going to go through this process, and they don't have the resources that New Orleans or New York will ever have. So I think the only analog I can imagine is, the Dust Bowl, where agricultural practices were inherently out of tune with the natural disaster. And the scale and scope of what the federal government came up with was the Agricultural Extension Service that could get to ground at tiny scale all around the nation. And in some ways, an analog would be a National Adaptation Extension Service. That's the kind of scale we need to be thinking about for all of these communities that are grappling with, sea level rise or heat or flooding or whatever it is. That's the only kind of progress, enterprise scale project I can imagine.
That's a great comment. I'll say, we're sitting here on West 11th Street in New York City. From RPA's perspective, we like to point out there are 782 municipalities in the tri-state region. One of them is New York City, and 781 are not. And the city, is about a third of the population. And I think that's a really, really good point. And the level of kind of resources that can be brought to bear by communities ranges widely. David, did you have a comment?
I think you should appreciate that you're our high-functioning government. I was struck by that as soon as I came here. Generally, this is the highest level of performance we get out of our governments. Maybe the West Coast, some. But people have to somehow believe they always won't be tricked and sold. In many of the places we go, Bridgeport sometimes, people have a history of, it's not going to work for us. They don't really distinguish between the aspect of the plan or the program and the project. They don't know. They just know that in the past it hasn't worked out very well for them. One of the things we learned in New Orleans was we were proposing solutions to problems, but we weren't proposing enough what people could do about those solutions in their own lives for themselves. So it's very important that people have something they can do about it at whatever scale. Second observation is that outside this, and maybe that's what's driving the development community, is they have their own interests, their own way of making money, as we're talking about. And you can find the concrete industry really, whether it's in New Orleans or New York or China, really does not care about this natural system talk. It just threatens their welfare. And until we find some other way to convert the industries and to make an industry of this instead of this sort of quasi-philanthropic, aren't we all interested in our bubble? But sort of in the larger framing, I think that, I'll go about as deep as you want to go, but the Kafka version is it's a threshold, and the threshold moment is when you don't see it as tragic, but you see it as serious. And it's a very serious issue, and I think we've seen it as a tragic issue. We keep seeing it as something we're going to lose. But people can't get up if that's the way they feel. So all the way through the industry, but people have to understand this is not your ordinary challenge. This is a big challenge. But it's a serious thing.
Right.
We can get to work and make money, and everybody will maybe do better.
Right. That dovetails, Seth, on what you were saying earlier. Can I ask you, since you now work outside New York City too, kind of for a little bit of your perspective from there also?
Yeah, I mean, it's a major challenge, the way that our metropolitan region is structured, and by extension, the way our entire country is structured, where we have large cities that have substantial resources, that are well-governed. We have some states that are prosperous and are well-governed. And then we have lots of communities that just don't have resources. I remember after we came out with our report following Hurricane Sandy, which Dan and I worked on, being on a panel, and there was a mayor of a New Jersey town, a seaside town, and I don't remember exactly which town it was, but she was talking about the fact that her annual city budget is $5 million. And I was thinking, our report that we put out cost us $5 million. The idea that these small towns and communities are going to be able to solve this problem without help from the outside, I think is probably unrealistic, especially when another reality that I learned about the region outside of New York City as I've started to work in and travel more in the region is that responsibilities are highly balkanized. So the town of X doesn't necessarily control all of the zoning within that town. They probably don't control the school district within that town. They probably don't control the sewer system. They may not control the fire department. And so how do you get all of these independent power structures to work together, especially when you have a problem that, as David said, in many cases is so enormous that people are just burying their heads in the sand and don't even want to deal with. And again, I think what this comes back to is a couple of things. One is you've got to break it down into smaller, digestible pieces. And two is I think we need to look to super regional governance structures to help these smaller jurisdictions to address this problem. And a lot of us would like to imagine creating a vast bureaucracy that's going to take over these responsibilities. I just don't think that that's likely to happen, but there are certainly ways that, for example, the state, using incentives, could encourage communities to do things that are in their own interest. The state could provide resources to communities to help them with the planning. There's a lot of talk about projects, and in many ways, projects are the things that excite people because they're physical, they're the answer. But sometimes the process and the structures are as important as the projects themselves. And I think that we as a region, we as a country need to be thinking about those structures and processes as much as we're thinking about the physical projects themselves.
That's a wonderful comment. I have to say, of course, I have to give props to the city for creating, in city planning, they actually have a Department of Regional Planning, and I know that Carolyn, who runs that, there is here, and maybe later she will, talk some about that and share that. But I mean, we've had with the city actually a very kind of proactive approach towards thinking regionally and connecting with the communities outside the 5 boroughs, which has been terrific. I, as you were speaking, Seth, Sacha, your comment about the Dust Bowl analog was a really interesting and provocative one for me. At the staff level, one of the ways we've been thinking about this summit RPA has been that 20 years ago, the challenge was not encroaching seas, but it was protecting drinking water. And again, we had the same issue, which was that several hundred municipalities doing land use and planning kind of at a local level was not a very good way to try and protect, say, the development in the Catskills and New York City's drinking water, or in the highlands of New Jersey, or protect the aquifer in eastern Long Island. And so what we did was created regional, over the last generation, essentially we've created these regional commissions, which don't wipe away municipalities by any means, but they do impose a new kind of regulatory framework on the aspects of their decisions that affect the drinking water supply. And, it's a constant battle. You have to keep fighting. You have to keep, improving the science and working with politicians and others. But I think from our perspective, to a large degree, we've had enormous success through that model. And so one of the kinds of ideas that we're kicking around for a region transformed, RPA's 4th plan, is to think about, would a regional commission approach be the way to kind of deal with something like this? And I think it's an idea that'll come up more over the course of the day as we do this. In a minute, I think I'm going to open this up to the audience for questions. So think about what you guys want to put on the table. But maybe my last one to the panel, and again, I'll kind of throw it open to anybody, would be, so now pretend you are actually RPA and kind of thinking about the 4th plan and what we're going to be saying about a year from now when we roll out the plan. What specifically, are there a few things that you'd like to see kind of promoted, elevated out of this? We are planning to make this a kind of central framework to the plan. People ask, I don't know if everyone in the room's familiar at RPA, the reason we call ourselves the Regional Plan Association instead of planning is that once every generation we create a regional plan. We did one in 1928, one in 1968, and one in 1996. And about a year from now, we're going to come out with our 4th plan in the history of our organization. And one of the biggest changes since 1996 is this entire issue. So kind of time for free advice. How would you kind of like to see us reflect this or keep moving on this? Because we consider this a kind of preamble to the entire document in some ways, one of the changes.
Yeah, so I think it's a phenomenally important effort to begin to think about climate smart development, and so I think it's great to see this. I guess I would, and maybe the challenge here is how to deal with the complexity of this in a plan, and the projections, the time frames. It might mean that the right answers need to evolve and not be we need this project here or this this fixed plan. It needs to somehow be a plan that is adaptable and deals with that complexity of our sea level rise. Should we be planning for 1, 3, or 6 feet, or 20, right, or something just different, and a way that it can continue to be built upon and adapted. I think that would be it's not an easy task, but I think that's the challenge of the plan, to make sure it's not fixed and therefore obsolete on day one because the climate is changing on us.
We certainly do try to identify, to paraphrase, the known knowns and the known unknowns and the unknowns and things. Thanks. Other comments, Seth?
I almost felt like what you were going to say was that you want to be careful about first day obsolescence because climate change is changing on you, which is possible. But I would just keep repeating what I've been saying, which is I think one, you need to break it down into smaller, manageable chunks. Two, I think that you need to think not just about projects but about processes and structures. And then the third thing. To parrot something that Dan said, but just to say it slightly differently, the phrase that we kept using with the SIR report was that whatever the plan is, it has to be modular and scalable. Mm-hmm. And I think that there are a lot of people out there who are looking for the big engineering solution. And the problem with the big engineering solution is it sucks in all of the resources, and if it succeeds, it's great, and if it doesn't succeed, you're left with nothing. And often, even if it succeeds, it still doesn't solve all of the problems. And I'm a real believer that when it comes to problems of this scale, that the right way to handle them is to come up with lots of different projects that as you get resources, you can plug in and you can scale to whatever resources you have, and you can phase them in over time. And I think that's exactly what Dan and his team are doing, and they deserve a lot of credit for that.
Thanks. Well, maybe, Sacha, I'll then amend my question to some degree, since Seth put the question of resources on the table and you're working from a philanthropic perspective. Also, what about the resources? Are they sufficient and more? And are you guys, because I know that philanthropy kind of looks to catalyze other investment.
Right. So I'm relatively new at that game, but my impression so far is that we like to, we're willing to put some of the first dollars in, but we like to think that kicks off all the rest, and then we can go on to another challenge.
This one may be with us for a while.
This one is going to be with us for a while, and I think that I think philanthropy is looking at this issue in lots of different ways, and is investing deeply in certain parts of it. I think there is an inevitable role for federal and state government here and municipal, but this kind of overarching service provision infrastructure where the technical information and the technical support together with the dollars, that's going to be delivered to especially smaller communities by entities at higher levels.
Right. Good one.
I think philanthropy is also really interested in investing in process. I think because this is an intense governance situation where you have to be able to initiate and sustain good dialogue over decades to deal with a shifting problem. So that's something that philanthropy is interested in, is that kind of social dialogue around issues, around a challenge. The last little bit I wanted to add to what this plan might do is it might start to frame and change people's expectations. Because I think expectations, whether it's your financial return or how long you're going to stay in a certain place or who's going to be kept whole, whether nature will be kept whole, those kinds of the expectations that people bring to this situation are going to preclude some good solutions and drive us toward others if we expect the future to look a lot like the present.
That's a great point. David, I'll let you,
could I just say that in the work in New Orleans, but if you look at the sponge city concept in China now that's been dictated, you still have organizational structures that don't match the problem. We need to go back to what is the problem and how should the organizations be versus what we have, which are residual organizations that maintain their turf and their terrain and therefore don't necessarily reorganize themselves to solve the problem. The other recommendation would be to make the city the laboratory. I know that's a cliche, but we act as if we can't do anything about sea level rise and all that. I believe that if you look at the planet, it gets greener because there's more carbon in the atmosphere. It's mitigating carbon. I think if we would actively green the cities and renaturalize the cities, I think we could mitigate some of the heat effects. I think there are things we as urban settlements can do, but unless this city and other cities become the laboratory of that with the monitoring and the understanding of that, but that would give us some objective that we could live into and design toward.
That's a wonderful point. Okay, so I'm going to do a Merv Griffin imitation here, and I'll wander around. I see one hand up over here, Bill, and then please introduce yourself and ask a question.
Thanks. Thanks, Tom. My name is Bill Golden from the National Institute for Coastal and Harbor Infrastructure. We're focused on rising sea levels, extreme storms, and aging infrastructure. And we advocate a change in federal policy from respond and repair to plan and invest. We advocate single federal agency leadership, and I'm going to use the F word, funding on the level of the federal highway system. I was struck by the Extension Service comment from Sacha. I think we do need a national role. There's a missing chair there, and I think it should be the federal government that's sitting there right now. But my question is, I'm a lifelong environmentalist, and I've favored very green solutions to issues. However, I want to congratulate RPA, particularly Tom, and particularly Rob, for focusing this on sea level rise. And I think there's a confusion between sea level rise and storm surge. And I would suggest that sea level rise is more open to local solutions and surge to more regional solutions. And my question to you is, and particularly to you, Dan, because I was at the CB1 meeting last night, in which you guys are doing excellent work. I really congratulate you personally for your leadership. But I think that given the monetary challenges of that plan, given the complexity of the urban environment, the geohydrological environment in which Manhattan is, should we be looking to change the parameters on federal funding so that the money that's available could be used more for sea level rise, in other words, barriers that are 6 feet high, rather than surge, which is 16 or 18 feet high, so that we could protect against sea level rise and leave the storm surge issue to a regional solution, such as a regional surge barrier? Thank you.
So I think, there's a couple of things to respond to on that. If you think in big picture of what some of the threats are from climate change, storm surge causes probably the highest economic losses. Heat will kill more people than any other natural hazard. But sea level rise can be existential in many ways. And I think, as it continues to creep into our neighborhoods, that is going to be a major challenge. To echo, I think, some of Seth's points around how we break this down into chunks, that's how we've been approaching the challenge of, we got a couple projects that are headed, that are looking in different ways at the risks. The Race Shorelines program, for instance, on sea level rise in particular neighborhoods, areas that are particularly vulnerable to storm surge. That's where we're advancing the storm surge projects. And your point around greening the city for heat is something that we're we know is incredibly important. The challenge, I think, around the regional storm surge barrier, I think, has been pretty well studied at this point around. It will draw all the resources, and all those resources don't exist at this point. I think if money were no object, it'd be great to have that as an extra, belt and suspenders, but we don't, and it's probably on the order of all the money we have across all of the risks that we're spending would probably have to go to that one thing, and that one thing would not have any value in reducing our risk to sea level rise. So that's just a little bit how we've been thinking about it. I think if there were more money available, we would love to have lots of extra things to reduce more risks down, as close to zero as possible. But I think we've taken a pretty pragmatic approach to the resources we have, the ability to invest while you're still securing more funds in order to make sure that we are buying down as much risk all across the city in any way that we can.
The F word, as he said.
Yeah.
Seth, you look like you wanted to jump in on that. But
No, and I was just going to add to what Dan said with the storm barriers. Also, don't forget the barrier goes somewhere, and that means that somewhere is inside the barrier and somewhere is outside the barrier. So you're creating a solution for part of the region, and then you're leaving the rest of the region entirely vulnerable for the reasons that Dan said, which is that you have no more resources to do anything for anywhere else. The other thing I would just say, listening to people talk about what the federal government should be doing in the missing chair, which I completely agree with, I do think we have to hope for the should, but live in the will. There's a reality, a political reality to our country right now. And so I think assuming that the federal government is going to come in and do the right thing, both with respect to regulation and with respect to the F word, is probably unrealistic. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep fighting for it. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep pushing to have it happen. But it also means that we've got to come up with solutions that assume that it's not going to be there.
Okay. Other questions? Suzanne.
I'm Suzanne D Geronimo. I'm an architect, and I'm chair of the Resilience Committee of Society of American Military Engineers. And Seth, you mentioned that engineering is not necessarily the fundable solution, and Dan said the same kind of thing, talking about engineering. But I think that engineering and the solutions that are out there that engineers have proposed, like the storm surge barrier, among other things, are part of the overall program that needs to occur in the region. And it's, New Orleans wouldn't be New Orleans if it weren't for the levees. So that there is some, major systems that need to be put in place here. I mean, if we're so vulnerable, then we need to look to the federal government, and actually all of our ports then, not just New York City. We're part of a big nation.
Yeah, I just want to clarify one thing, and I would imagine Dan would agree. I don't think anyone is saying that engineering is not part of the solution. Engineering is the solution. It's just the mega project, the one mega project that's going to require all of your resources may not be the best approach, the optimal approach, for all of the reasons that Dan and I have mentioned.
Yeah, and to dispute, engineering's not the solution. I mean, it's how we got here by over-engineering. New Orleans is the way it is because, it wasn't below sea level in 1920, and we imposed a set of pumps on the city that drained the place and allowed us to occupy areas that were marginal, sunk the city, build a levee. The engineers build the levees. We don't do the geotechnical correctly, and we have 38 failures. So engineering alone is not the solution. It's not the beginning point, and I can offend probably half the room with that statement. I think that the scale of I think nature is still what we've turned away from. I'll go back to something really, I guess, queer, but Noah's Ark and all life was on Earth. Really, David, really all life, nothing was in the sea? We continue to see that we're the hero, and the engineer became manifestation of hero, I'm afraid. I think the smallest scale that works is the one that we should be employing. One of the challenges of doing the mega solutions, the Corps of Engineers building and saving us again, giving us another shot at sustaining ourselves, which is going to be expensive. All the money went into very large contracts. And if you were to take and build a storm surge barrier here, you would create no new industry. You would create no new sort of micro patterns and so forth. And I think the resilience of the community is going to depend upon people having enough money to move themselves and trade. And so I'm skeptical of the mega solution saving us, because the mega solution is what we've been seeing, and I don't believe in the bigger and bigger corporation. All said too much.
I can't not jump in as probably as the professional engineer on the panel. But certainly a conflicted engineer, because I certainly see the hubris that we've brought ourselves in certain areas by over relying on the engineering. The engineering has to serve people, and it has to serve those most vulnerable among us, and that doesn't mean just the concrete and steel solutions. We need to make sure we have integrated solutions. We need natural. We need engineered solutions, but they need to be done in service of the residents and the people that are here, and we can't lose sight of that, because then we will fall trap into the big concrete and steel solutions only.
Great.
Let me just jump in by saying that I think there is a mega solution, and that is that and this get back to David's point, that nature, while New York City may not be saved by a lot of wetlands and natural infrastructure, at a national scale, there's been some estimates that about half of the number of people, the value of residential structures, the number of poor families, that we could reduce the hazard to about half of those factors by maintaining natural infrastructure, natural areas, wetlands in place over the course of the century. So if we could knock down the cost of the engineered part by half, then we have a shot.
Then we have a chance
and we
of
know
doing it.
exactly how to do it because it already exists. It's in place. We just have to make sure that it doesn't disappear.
Well, if I can jump on that to say, one of the things that jumps out at us through the maps and the work that Rob has done, you kind of see historically the way we developed our communities, that many of the, frankly, wealthier parts of our of our communities tend to be higher up and tend to be more protected. And so kind of, again, the last bullet on this, which I want to kind of highlight, paying attention to the socially vulnerable. And often the natural systems tend to be the ones that will be protecting those communities because they were where the public housing was put or other things was in the vulnerable areas. And so there's also often a nexus between that strategy, Sacha, you're talking about, and really that final bullet, which is a key one for us, which is paying attention to the most vulnerable communities and populations. Yeah, Carter.
Carter Strickland, HDR. I thought I might address the empty chair there a little bit and pose a question to the panel, picking up on the last point made about natural systems and building them. I think there might be a federal-state role, I think there is, in regulatory relief, and that's a term we have to use carefully, but one that might have some more traction in the next 4 years with in-water projects that can be positive. And Dan, you've got a great example of Living Reef. New Orleans famously has this $50 billion plan, or the state of Louisiana. And so I'd ask the panel to maybe address the future regulatory situation with carefully constructed modular in-water fill projects.
Scalable, that was his word.
That's right.
Yeah, Dan or Seth, either.
I mean, I think certainly the regulatory structure that is in place was put in place before we faced some of these risks. Now, I think you're right, Carter, that it's it's a careful place. The point is not to gut environmental regulations. The point is to make regulations that are smarter. And I think that the living shoreline examples around the country are a really important example of this. Of by trying to restore oyster reefs, you run into the idea that you are filling in tidal wetlands, and it's not clear that those regulations were really meant to preclude the restoration of oyster reefs, for instance. And so there may be things like that we need to be smart about approaching, but there is it's a difficult it's a difficult conversation to start because a lot of people read that as, oh, you want to get rid of NEPA or something like that, and that's really not the point. You want to make sure the regulations are smart given the new risks that we face.
Great. Any final comments or questions? Because we're running to the end of the time anyway. In that case, okay, I'll give you, sir, one last.
My name is Warren Kurtz. I'm a retiree now, but I was formerly Deputy Commissioner for Engineering at New York City DEP. I won't debate any of the remarks about engineers, but looking up at the agenda, I see the word resilience. And resilience implies a bouncing back. And as we heard from our first speaker, sea level rise is not a bouncing back, it's a permanent condition. And I also see the word adaptation, which means changing. And changing usually on a site-by-site or facility-by-facility kind of basis. What I don't see up there is the word protection. Right? And protection, to me, comes back to the people who are outside the adaptation, who are outside the projects that are being built for resilience. And I think that weakens the discussion. It doesn't make the discussion about how to address all of these situations comprehensive or robust.
Thank you. Does anyone want to some degree, I want to say, I think our agenda, we do have other panels, I think, that we want to try and get at some of that issue and make sure that we talk about all communities. But does anyone want to respond to that or jump on its final? Well, then, please join me in thanking this panel for these terrific comments.
Great. And thank you, Tom, for moderating an excellent conversation.